Hey everybody, this is Tim Wolf. Today's topic is the news that Gibson, the 120-year-old venerable guitar manufacturer, American guitar manufacturer, has acquired the first really boutique guitar amplifier manufacturer, Mesa Boogie. Mesa Boogie was started by Randy Smith in California, and we're going to go into the history of that, and we're going to talk about what this means for the guitar world and the status of the guitar world today. My name's Tim Wolf, and I'm a Nashville singer-songwriter artist. There's a link down below where you can listen to some of my music, and there's also some merch there. You can check that out, and I appreciate that if you would. And also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell to be notified when new videos are uploaded. Yeah, I see you. Go ahead. Do it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Randy Smith, who started Mesa Boogie in 1969 in California, near Berkeley, California, is where he was born, has now sold his company to Gibson. And the amount that he sold it for is undisclosed. So after about 51 years in business, starting from 1969, Randy Smith has decided at 75 years old to sell his namesake company, to sell his company to Gibson. And I'm excited about it. I mean, first of all, what's the situation in the guitar manufacturing world today? There was a period of time where it appeared that guitar was dying. In fact, my number one guitar hero, Eric Clapton, was quoted as saying that guitar is basically dying. Well, that's not the case now. In fact, Fender announced that 2020 was their record sales as far as selling guitars. And Taylor Guitars has announced that they've had some record sales. Martin Guitars are having record sales. Martin has been around for well over 100 years. 100 and probably older. I think they started in the late 1800s. So they've been over 120 years old. Gibson was started by Orville Gibson in the aughts, 1905 roughly, and started out making archtop guitars and other instruments, mandolins, things like that. That's a long time to be in history. And of course, with inflation, today's dollars are different than 50 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago. But nonetheless, the sales of units of guitars is also at record highs based on articles that I've read. And people are digging in, and it's not just guys, women, and I love it. Women are buying guitars at record numbers as well. So basically, probably what's happened, we were before recent decades, or recent decade or so, we were seeing only half of our population who was really interested in buying instruments. And now both genders, male and female, are excited about playing guitar, buying guitars and learning how to play them. And it's a great time. It's great for the instrument. I think it's phenomenal. And these companies are in the black. Both Gibson and Fender have had troubled times. There's been different stories or different things that have happened, like when the Japanese manufacturers came in the 70s and really kicked them down at the knees, and they couldn't compete because the quality was so much better from Japan. Different recessions. Both Fender and Gibson have declared bankruptcy at least 3 times in their history, and they're still surviving. And Gibson especially, I'm so happy. My first real guitar was a Gibson Les Paul, 1981 Gibson Les Paul, my first real professional level guitar that I bought myself in the music store. And so I have a fond heart for Gibson. I also do for Fender. My number one guitar these days is a 1997 Fender Strat Plus. So I love both of those. Now Fender, of course, Leo Fender started as electronic manufacturer or repairer, and so the electronic side of it was really his forte, where he started and then he branched off into making guitars. And so many of the iconic designs, like the Bassman, 4x10-inch Bassman, is an iconic. And in fact, Marshall took that design and just reduplicated that design and used British tubes to make the Marshall sound. And so in fact, the way that Randall Smith tells the story, when he grew up, his dad played the clarinet, played the sax, and was first chair clarinet for the Oakland Symphony. And so there was music in his home as he was growing up. And his sister played piano, and his dad had him learn the clarinet, and he said his dad would make him play the same note for weeks until he got it right, until he'd teach him how to play another note. It sounded like a horrible way to get a kid excited about learning music. And then, of course, he was close to San Francisco Bay, and in the 60s San Francisco was the hopping place. There were a lot of bands that came out of there, Fillmore, and there was just a lot of great things that happened. The music was just hopping in that area, and he got involved with that, and he joined a band, learned how to play drums, because it's kind of hard to play clarinet in a blues band. So he took up the drums, and so he was playing in blues bands. So the way Randall Smith talks about his life, when he was about 10 or 12, a Canadian guy named Ernie, who worked for his dad, introduced him to tubes and showed him a little bit how to do electronics. And that was before stereo, when hi-fi, if you wanted hi-fi, you had to build it yourself. And so he played around with that until he was about 11 or 12. And then he met a guy named Stan Stilson, whose business was building industrial control systems. In fact, when he would go over to his house, he was building the control panel or the control console for the first American nuclear submarine. So, and he was doing it in his garage. So this was a real high-powered guy. And anyway, he knocked on the door, and he had brought his carvings. He was trying to get a Boy Scout a badge with carvings, and he knocked on his door because he knew this guy could help him. And it was an ex-Marine, and he said it was like having the door open, and there was Clint Eastwood, angry on a bad day, Clint Eastwood. And he took it back in his wood shop and took the 3 carvings that Randall had brought with him, and he ran them through the bandsaw, cutting them, and he said, "That's what I think of your carvings, and that's what I think of you." And this guy was very stern and very demanding, but he stuck around, and he learned how to do wood carvings, and he also said that's where he learned how to have the quality that he put into Mesa Boogie amps, and they definitely are well-built amps. They don't cut corners, and that's where he learned. He said, "Do it right, and otherwise don't do it all." As he said, his interest turned to cars, girls, and rock and roll, and he was playing in a band, playing as a drummer. And his buddy, on a gig, his buddy's amp, his Sun amp, went up in smoke. And he offered to fix it to him because he said they didn't have any money to go out and have anyone else fix it. And because he had been taught how to work with tube amps, he was able to actually fix it and make it work. And right after he did that, his friend said, "Hey, let's open a music store," which actually in 1965 in San Francisco Bay Area was probably not a bad call, because back then music stores were the heartbeat of musicians, and you would often meet musicians and you could form bands by going to music store. It's not like really it is today. That really isn't the case today. But I remember meeting a guy from, I was playing in an open mic night in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and there was a bass player there, an older guy, and he said that he grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, and he said in the 60s when he was in Duluth, Minnesota, you had to have live music if you were a club owner. If you didn't have live music, nobody would come to your club and dance. How different it is today, right? I mean, a lot of bands beg to have places that they can play. But he said that club owners would go to music stores and beg musicians who were hanging out there to form a band so they could play at their club so that he could have live music. That to me is mind-blowing because it's turned 180 degrees today. Most bands beg to find a place to play. So anyway, it was a great time to start a music store, and they started a music store, and his buddy was the sales in the front and he was doing the repairs in the back. So he built up a clientele. They would come for repairs. And one day, one of his friends, Country Joe and the Fish, Barry Melton of Country Joe and the Fish, and Country Joe and the Fish they were at Woodstock 1969, and kind of an iconic band from that era. And he wanted to play a trick on him. So he had this little Princeton amp, which people thought was a practice amp, and he was going to play a trick on him and just hot rod it up. And where he got the idea from, because he also loved cars, and he was looking at these tiny little British cars, and he would wonder how, if someone could fit a high-powered engine into one of these small little British sports cars and then just really surprise people at a drag race. And so that's where he got the idea, and he transferred that over. What if I take a Princeton amp and put a high-powered amp inside of it, and people will be surprised. So he took out the transformers and completely rewired it. He said he rewired it based on Leo Fender's late 50s 4x10 Bassman amp, which I mentioned earlier. And so he fit it in there, and then he realized that the speaker wasn't big enough. It was a 10-inch speaker, he needed a 12-inch. And he did his calculations, and he realized he could just barely fit it in there and make room for it. So he put a JBL 12-inch speaker in there, which was in demand at the time. And he brought it out and had it in front. And he asked somebody who was a guitar player who happened to be in front of the store, the music store, hanging out, would you play this and tell me what you think? And it just happened to be Carlos Santana. And Santana started playing through it. Well, first of all, Santana said, I don't want to play through that. That's a practice amp. That's Princeton. I don't play through that. I need more power than that. And he convinced him to play it. And Santana started playing. And he, as the story goes, the way Randy tells it, it went on for hours. And by the time before Santana was done, people were lined up in the front on the sidewalk listening to Santana play. And when Santana finally quit playing, he looked at Randy and he looked at the amp and he said, that thing really boogies, man. And that's where the name for the amps that he used, Mesa Boogie, came from. Now, where the Mesa came from, another thing, Randy Smith, very similar to Leo Fender, it seems, very handy with his hands, able to learn new things. How he made his living, because the music store, Prune Music, didn't make a lot of money. He had some other ventures, and one of his ventures was jacking up houses. And he said he started with his own house, which he said one end of the house was 18 inches lower than the other, jacking up old houses and pouring concrete underneath them to shore them up. And the other thing he got involved with was fixing old Mercedes engines, because he was interested in cars, and somewhere along the way he picked up the ability to fix engines. And he said the one thing he learned when he got tearing into old Mercedes engines is he couldn't believe the difference in design between the British engines and the Mercedes engines, and it just reinforced his mantra, do it right the first time, because the Germans, the Mercedes engines, were so much better built. And that's still true today. I mean, there are no British car manufacturers left. I guess Range Rover is still around, and maybe, I suppose, Rolls-Royce, kind of a specialized. But back then, there were a lot more British manufacturers, and they've just disappeared, whereas all the German makers are still around. And the quality is definitely there. I mean, I love Mercedes. My car is a Mercedes. Anyway, so he had these two gigs where he was doing construction work, foundational work, and he was also renovating cars. And so he needed a name for a company. He was just a kid. By this time, he might have been early 20s or still a teenager. And so he came up with the name Mesa Engineering. He just made it up off the top of his head. And that's what he started his company. And so that's what he called it, the Mesa Boogie amp. Now, when he rebuilt that Princeton, everybody came to him, and everybody that had a Princeton wanted him to remake it and rebuild it, and he did, but that kind of ran out of, there weren't any more Princeton amps to rebuild. Everybody that had a Princeton had gotten rebuilt. And still, even back in that day, people were complaining, guitar players were complaining that even Santana complained about his reworked, his souped up Princeton. He still couldn't get what he wanted out of it. So Randall Smith was working on a Cron amplifier, and he worked up a preamp, and he added additional stages, and he had 3 different volume controls along within the preamp that he could adjust the volume, and that's now called a cascading. So what he did is he took, let me make sure that he didn't know how much signal the Crowns needed to drive them, so he'd cover his bases by adding an extra complete stage of tube gain to the basic preamp architecture, adding 3 variable gain controls at critical points in the circuit, and then they hooked it up, and it didn't work, of course, because they had it hooked up right, but then when they did finally hook it up, they hit a chord and it just literally blew them back. So they realized that they could, by adjusting these 3 volumes, they could dial in unheard of amounts of gain with the first 2 controls, and then control the loudness with the third. Because before that, there were some master volume, but they didn't really do anything, because there were no controls in the preamp that controlled the volume at the different stages of the gain. And he invented, Randall Smith, by himself invented high gain amplifiers, where you can drive the preamp and get that tone and that distortion and that sustain, and the volume can still be at room temperature. I mean, room level volume. So that was one of his first contributions to the amp world. Hey everybody, this is Tim Wolf. Thank you so much for watching my video. Please go to the link down below in the description. There's a Bitly link. Listen to my music at Spotify. I appreciate it very much. It means a lot to an artist if you follow them. If you would be kind enough to like the video if you enjoyed it and share it with your friends. Finally, be sure to subscribe. And also there are other videos on this screen that you can watch. And I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.